Imagine feeling insects crawling under your skin, only to be told it's all in your head. For thousands with Morgellons, this is a reality. The medical establishment calls it a shared delusion. But what if the strange fibers they pull from their skin are real? What if the cause is a bacterium that has jumped from plants to people, turning human cells into factories for a terrifying new disease? This is the story of the doctor who dared to believe them. In a quiet suburban bedroom, the only light comes from the cold blue glow of a laptop screen. The screen illuminates the face of Sarah Jenkins, a woman in her 40s whose exhaustion is so profound it seems etched into her very bones. Her hands tremble, not from a fever but from a mixture of adrenaline and despair. She is filming her own arm with a webcam, the image grainy and unsettlingly intimate. With a pair of fine-tipped tweezers, she carefully, painfully, pulls at something emerging from an inflamed lesion on her forearm. It is a thin, wiry fiber, the color of crimson. "It feels like bugs," she says to the camera, her voice strained and raspy. "It feels like bugs crawling under my skin. All day, all night. You can to sleep, you can to think. You just itch, you just feel it." She finally succeeds in extracting the fiber and holds it up to the camera, a tiny red thread against the pale landscape of her skin. The doctors say I am crazy. They say I am imagining it, that I am scratching myself and then sticking carpet fibers in the wounds to get attention. A single tear traces a path down her cheek. But I am not. The fibers are real. You can see them. Why won't anyone believe me? The offices of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta are a world away from Sarah Jenkins' darkened bedroom. Here, the light is bright, sterile, and unforgiving. The air is filtered, the floors are polished, and the problems are meant to be orderly and solvable. Dr. Isla Ramsey sat at her desk, a picture of professional composure, though a hint of weariness lingered in her intelligent eyes. She was a scientist, a soldier in the endless war against pathogens, a woman who believed in data, peer review, and the unassailable logic of the scientific method. Her superior, Dr. Marcus Thorne, stood over her desk. He was a man who wore his authority as comfortably as his tailored suit. With a soft thud, he dropped a thick file, bound in blue, onto her desk blotter. The label, printed in stark block letters, read, "Morgellons." "Isla," Thorne began, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "Time to put this one to bed. The consensus from NIH and every major dermatological board is clear. Delusional parasitosis, a textbook case of a shared psychogenic illness fueled by the internet." He tapped the cover of the file. "Our resources are stretched thin with real threats. I can to have my best investigators chasing internet phantoms, write up the summary report, rubber stamp the official findings, and let S close the book on it for good. We have real pathogens to worry about." Ramsey looked at the file, then back at Thorne. She knew the protocol. This was a cleanup job, a bureaucratic task to align the CDC's stance with the established medical orthodoxy. It was her job to enforce that orthodoxy. "Understood, Marcus," she said, her voice betraying none of her professional ennui. It was just another file to close. The CDC's archival records were kept in a vast, climate-controlled room that hummed with the sound of air purifiers. It was a library of human suffering, cataloguing every disease and outbreak the institution had ever touched. Ramsey sat at a lone desk, the Morgellons file open before her. For hours, she waded through its contents, her initial skepticism hardening with every page. The file was a chaotic mess of patient testimonies, many of them rambling and incoherent. They were filled with frantic, capitalized screeds about government conspiracies, chemtrails, nanobots, and alien implants. It was a digital fever swamp, a perfect storm of anxiety, misinformation, and genuine psychological distress. It reinforced everything Thorne had said. She was about to close the file when she found a dusty appendix from an earlier, inconclusive CDC study from 2008. It was mostly raw data and lab requests. Tucked at the very back were scanned copies of a lab technician's handwritten notes. She skimmed the pages, her eyes glazing over the technical jargon, until a single line, underlined twice, caught her eye. It was a note about the fiber samples they had analyzed. Fibers resist heat up to 1400 F. Inconclusive, but inconsistent with nylon or cotton contaminants. Ramsey stopped. She read the line again. 1400 degrees Fahrenheit. That was far beyond the melting point of any common synthetic fiber. And cotton, a natural cellulose fiber, would simply burn to ash. It was a small detail, an anomaly, a single piece of hard observational data that did not fit the neat, tidy narrative of delusional illness. It was a loose thread, and Dr. Isla Ramsey, despite her professionalism, despite her weariness, was a scientist. And scientists, by their very nature, pull on loose threads. Night had fallen over Atlanta. Ramsey sat alone in her office, the city lights twinkling beyond her window. The room was divided by two sources of light. On one monitor, she had the draft of the official CDC report she was supposed to be writing. It was filled with cold clinical phrases. No common underlying medical condition, no infectious source identified, symptoms consistent with delusional infestation. It was the voice of the establishment, dismissive and final. On her other monitor, she had Sarah Jenkins' blog. It was a gallery of suffering. Dozens of high-resolution photos and videos showed the strange, colorful fibers, red, blue, black, emerging from skin lesions. It was raw, unsettling, and undeniably real, at least in the photographic sense. Ramsey's gaze flickered between the two screens. The official dismissal on one side, the visceral proof of something on the other. And in her mind, the lab tech note echoed, inconsistent with nylon or cotton. She looked at the photo of the crimson fiber Sarah had pulled from her own arm. She looked at the report that called Sarah delusional. With a quiet sigh, she closed the official CDC report draft. The blinking cursor on the blank page was a silent accusation. She could not, in good conscience, sign her name to a conclusion that ignored a piece of contradictory data, no matter how small. She opened a new, secure messaging client on her computer, a tool used for sensitive internal inquiries. She created a new message and, after a moment's hesitation, typed in the subject line. Morgellons fiber samples, unofficial inquiry. She had made her decision. She was going to pull the thread. Dr. Isla Ramsey had pulled the thread. Now, she had to see where it led. Her unofficial inquiry began with a single, encrypted video call. On her screen, the face of Sarah Jenkins appeared, drawn and tight with a hostility that was almost a physical presence. "Let me guess," Sarah began, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "UV reviewed my file and you have some new insights into my anxiety disorder. Are you here to tell me I am crazy, doctor? To prescribe me another antipsychotic that doesn't stop the crawling?" Ramsey kept her own voice calm and level, a deliberate counterpoint to Sarah's raw anger. "No, Ms. Jenkins, I am not a psychiatrist. I am an epidemiologist, and I am not interested in your diagnosis. I am interested in the fibers." That stopped Sarah short. A flicker of surprised curiosity broke through her hardened exterior. "I was reviewing the old CDC file on Morgellons," Ramsey continued, choosing her words carefully. "I found a lab note from a 2008 study. It said the fiber samples they tested were resistant to extreme heat in a way that was inconsistent with common textiles. That's a data point, not a delusion. It was never followed up on. I want to follow up on it." Sarah was silent for a long moment, assessing Ramsey, searching for the trick. "Why?" she finally asked. "Because good science doesn't ignore inconvenient data," Ramsey said simply. "I want to test the fibers again, but I need new samples. Samples collected under a protocol that no one can dismiss. I've emailed you a list of instructions. A sterile collection kit is on its way to you. If you are willing to help, I am willing to look." At the fibers, and only the fibers. For the first time, Sarah S.'s expression softened, the anger replaced by a fragile, desperate hope. "Okay, doctor," she said. "Okay." That night, Ramsey fell down the rabbit hole. She typed Morgellons into a search engine and descended into the strange, chaotic world of the patient community. It was a digital ecosystem built on a foundation of shared suffering and profound mistrust of the outside world. Her screen became a montage of pain and paranoia. She scrolled through frantic forum posts where users described their symptoms in excruciating detail, sharing tips on which brand of tweezers were best for extractions. She found websites that connected the fibers to chemtrails, alien implants, secret government experiments. There were links to discredited papers and YouTube videos of people showing off their own DIY microscope setups. Their commentary, a mix of genuine scientific curiosity and wild, unfalsifiable speculation. And woven through it all were the video testimonials. Heartbreaking, raw videos from people all over the world. A farmer in rural Ohio, a teacher in the UK, a retired nurse in California. They didn't speak of nanobots or conspiracies. They just spoke of the constant maddening crawling under their skin. They spoke of the doctors who had laughed at them, who had called them liars, who had tried to have them committed. They cried on camera, showing their lesions, their jars of meticulously collected fibers, begging for someone, anyone, to believe them. Ramsey scrolled for hours, the sterile detachment she had cultivated over her entire career slowly eroding. The scientist in her was appalled by the pseudoscience, but the doctor in her was moved by the undeniable global scale of the suffering. She finally leaned back, the cacophony of voices and theories swirling in her head, a weary empathy dawning in her eyes. The signal of a real, unexplained phenomenon was there, but it was buried under an avalanche of noise. A week later, a small, discreet package arrived at Ramsey S. office. It was from Sarah Jenkins. Inside was the sterile collection kit, now containing several sealed vials, each holding a tiny, filament-like fiber. That night, Ramsey took the package not to the high-security labs on the upper floors, but down to a little-used general pathology lab in the basement. A friendly, sharp-witted lab technician named Ben Carter was waiting for her. He was in his late 20s, with a reputation for being brilliant and discreet. "Morgellons, huh?" Ben said, with a wry smile as he looked at the vials. "You're not the first person from this building to be curious about these things off the record. Let us see what you've got." His casual confirmation that she wasn't alone sent a small thrill through Ramsey. She wasn't the only one who had seen the cracks in the official story. Working under the low, humming lights of the empty lab, they began to prepare the samples. Ben handled the equipment with an expert-esque touch, mounting one of the fibers onto a slide for the scanning electron microscope. The process was quiet, focused, and felt deeply illicit. Every quiet footstep in the hallway outside made Ramsey flinch. They were breaking the rules, defying the institutional dogma, and it was both terrifying and exhilarating. Ben slid the sample into the microscope S chamber. "All right," he said, turning to the monitor. "Let S see what the bogeyman looks like up close." The image that appeared on the electron microscope S monitor was stunning. Projected in ghostly shades of grey, the fiber was unlike anything Ramsey had ever seen. It was not a smooth, uniform strand like a piece of nylon or cotton. It was complex, almost organic, with a bizarre filamentous structure and strange, hook-like appendages. It looked less like a textile and more like some kind of alien microorganism. "Whoa," Ben breathed, leaning closer to the screen. "That is definitely not a carpet fiber." He typed a series of commands, initiating a basic spectrometry scan to determine its elemental composition. A graph appeared on the screen. "Well," Ben said, pointing to the peaks on the chart, "it S, carbon-based, with oxygen, nitrogen, a protein structure of some kind. But it is not keratin, so it is not hair. It is not cotton, not polyester, not nylon." He shook his head. I have no idea what this is. He ran another test, one that would scan for genetic material. Ramsey held her breath. This was the crucial question. If it was a stray hair, a skin fragment, a piece of plant matter, it would have DNA. The machine whirred for a moment, and then a new result popped up on the screen. Ben stared at it, his eyebrows shooting up. No way. What is it? Ramsey asked, her voice tight. He turned to her, his face a mixture of confusion and excitement. That is the weirdest part, he said. There is no DNA. None at all. Whatever this thing is, it's not from a plant, it is not from an animal, and it is not from a human. An irrefutable fact, a piece of hard scientific data that shattered the official narrative into a million pieces. The fibers were not a delusion. They were real, they were unidentifiable, and they were a complete and total mystery. The words on the whiteboard in Dr. Isla Ramsey's office glowed under the lamp she had left on her desk. 2 words written in thick black marker: no DNA. It was a conclusion so profound, so paradigm-shifting, that it had kept her at the office long after the rest of the CDC had gone home. It was a fact that acted like a fulcrum, lifting the entire Morgellons mystery out of the realm of psychiatry and dropping it squarely into the world of unexplained biology. This was the turning point. For weeks, she had been an archaeologist of a dead case file, tasked with giving it a decent burial. Now, she was an explorer on the shores of a new continent. Her goal was no longer to simply close a file or to debunk a delusion. Her goal was to discover the origin and nature of a completely unknown biological artifact. She turned to her computer, her focus sharp and intense. The draft of the summary report that Thorne had ordered her to write was still open, its clinical, dismissive phrases mocking her. She deleted the entire document. In its place, she opened a new file, typing a new title: Preliminary Report on Analysis of Unidentified Cutaneous Filaments. She began to write, not as a bureaucrat closing a case, but as a scientist opening one. She detailed Ben's methodology, the spectrometry results, the shocking absence of genetic material. She was building a case, not just about the fibers, but for a new investigation altogether. She was no longer following the institutional narrative. She was challenging it with undeniable data. The next morning, Ramsey walked into Dr. Marcus Thorne's office. She held a tablet with her preliminary findings, her heart beating a steady, determined rhythm. She was prepared for skepticism, for debate. She was not prepared for his utter indifference. She presented the data clearly and concisely, showing him the high-resolution electron microscope images of the bizarre hooked fibers. She showed him the spectrometry charts that ruled out every common contaminant. She emphasized the final, crucial point: the complete lack of human DNA. Thorne barely glanced at the tablet. He leaned back in his expensive leather chair, a look of paternalistic disappointment on his face. "Isla," he said, his voice laced with condescension. "It's obviously a novel contaminant from their environment, a new type of industrial polymer from their clothes or carpets. You're chasing shadows, getting lost in the weeds because these people have gotten into your head." "Marcus, the data doesn't support that," Ramsey countered, trying to keep the frustration from her voice. "The heat resistance, the protein composition. The data is irrelevant if the premise is flawed," Thorne cut her off. He slid a printed form across the polished surface of his desk. It was the original case closure summary. "I'm ordering you to cease this line of inquiry. Sign the final report as we discussed. Your career at the CDC, your future here, depends on your ability to prioritize real threats, not internet folklore. Don't throw that away for this." The threat was no longer veiled. It was a direct, brutal command. Ramsey stared at the form, at the line waiting for her signature. Signing it would be a lie. Refusing would be professional suicide. She looked at Thorne, at his cold, unyielding eyes, and realized he wasn't interested in the truth. He was interested in protecting the dogma. Ramsey sat at her small kitchen table that night, the anger and frustration from her meeting with Thorne churning inside her. He wouldn't block her access to the labs. That would leave a paper trail. But he would question her judgment, her fitness, her priorities. He would bury her under a mountain of bureaucratic nonsense until this case and her career suffocated. He had made it clear, the CDC would not help her. She stared at her home computer, at the stunningly clear image of the bizarre blue fiber from Sarah S. arm. It looked like something from another world. The search for truth could not end here, not because of a cynical bureaucrat. She made a decision. She opened a secure, encrypted email client. She scrolled through her contacts until she found the name, Dr. John Meisner, her old mentor from Johns Hopkins. He was a brilliant, eccentric man, now one of the world's leading experts in polymer science and protein chemistry. He was also a man who loved a good puzzle more than he feared academic politics. She began to type. "John," she wrote, "I have a strange one. Something I can investigate through official channels. I need an outside opinion, completely off the record. I've attached some electron microscope images. Tell me I'm crazy, or tell me what you think this could be." She attached the files, her finger hovering over the send button for a long moment before she finally clicked it. The email was gone. The die was cast. The next day, Ramsey left the CDC during her lunch break. She wore a simple hoodie, the hood pulled up, and sunglasses, feeling like a spy in a cheap movie. She walked several blocks to a generic post office, the kind with flickering fluorescent lights and peeling paint. Inside her bag was a small padded envelope with no return address. She waited in line, her heart pounding. This was no longer just an email. This was a physical act. She was sending a controlled substance, a piece of evidence from a CDC case file, to an outside party without authorization. This was a fireable offense. It was quite possibly illegal. When she reached the counter, she handed the package to the clerk. It was addressed to Dr. Meisner S. University Lab. As she slid the small envelope across the worn counter, she felt a profound sense of crossing a line, a point of no return. She was no longer just bending the rules. She was shattering them. She had defied her superior. She had broken protocol, and she had put her trust in a single, strange fiber that the world had dismissed as a delusion. The package disappeared into a mail slot, and with it, any hope of turning back. Isla Ramsey was now operating completely on her own, a rogue agent in pursuit of a truth her own institution refused to see. Dr. Marcus Thorne was a man of his word. Retaliation at the CDC was not a dramatic confrontation. It was a quiet, suffocating deluge of paper. In the days after she mailed the package, Dr. Isla Ramsey found her desk piled high with the tasks reserved for junior researchers or those being managed out. Tedious, unrelated budget reviews from other departments. Mind-numbing safety protocol updates that had already been updated twice. She was being buried alive in bureaucracy. Her access to the main labs quietly downgraded to non-priority. Her request for resources lost in a sudden, inexplicable backlog. She was an island in the middle of a busy office. Colleagues who once stopped to chat now offered only brief, tight-lipped nods. One afternoon, Ben Carter passed her open door, his arms full of lab reports. He paused for a fraction of a second, just long enough to give her a look of profound sympathy, a silent acknowledgement of her exile, before he hurried on, afraid to be seen talking to her. The message from the institution was clear. She had chosen her side, and it was the losing one. The power of the CDC was not a weapon of force, but one of administrative friction, designed to grind her curiosity and her career into dust. For 2 weeks, she heard nothing. She did her pointless paperwork by day, and by night, she waited. Every ping from her laptop made her jump. Finally, late one evening in her small apartment, an email arrived. The subject line was blank. The sender was an anonymized, encrypted address. Her hands trembled as she clicked it open. It was the report from her old professor, Dr. Meisner. She began to read, and the world fell away. The first part of the report confirmed her and Ben S.'s initial findings. The fiber was a composite, a bizarre hybrid of protein and cellulose, but it was the second part that made her stop breathing. Meisner's lab, with its advanced isotopic mass spectrometers, had analyzed the cellulose. It was not from a plant. The isotopic markers are unmistakable, Meisner had written. This is bacterially produced cellulose. Specifically, the signature is a near-perfect match for the cellulose produced by one organism, Agrobacterium tumefaciens. Ramsey's eyes grew wide. Agrobacterium. She knew it well from her microbiology textbooks. It was a soil bacterium, famous in the world of botany and genetic engineering for one incredible, almost magical ability. It could transfer a piece of its own DNA, the TI plasmid, into the cells of a host plant, hijacking the plant's cellular machinery to serve its own needs. It was a natural genetic engineer. But it was a plant pathogen. It had never been known to interact with human cells. This piece of hard, external scientific data blew the case wide open, suggesting a bizarre, terrifying intersection of botany, microbiology, and human pathology. Ramsey stood before the whiteboard in her living room, which was now covered in frantic sketches of DNA plasmids and diagrams of cell walls. Her mind was on fire. For an hour, she paced back and forth, connecting the disparate, impossible dots. Agrobacterium transfers DNA. The fibers are made of a protein and a bacterially produced cellulose. The fibers themselves contain no DNA. And then, the final, horrific realization dawned on her. A moment of synthesis so profound it felt like a physical shock. The fibers weren't the pathogen. They were a byproduct. They were the symptom. The disease itself was the bacterium. A bacterium, likely genetically modified, that was somehow doing to human skin cells what it naturally does to plants, inserting a piece of its DNA and forcing those cells to produce something alien, forcing them to produce these bizarre, non-human filaments. The crawling sensation, it wasn't a delusion. It was the feeling of this process happening on a microscopic level, the feeling of your own body being hijacked, turned into a factory for something that wasn't you. It was a theory that explained everything: the pain, the lesions, the fibers, the lack of a clear infectious agent. She had done it. She had found the answer. It was a scientific discovery of monumental importance. And as her phone began to ring, she was about to discover just how little time she had. The call was from a frantic, weeping Sarah Jenkins, but the face on the screen was not in a darkened bedroom. It was in the pale, sterile confines of a hospital room. Sarah was lying in bed, an IV drip in her arm, her face pale and sweating with fever. "Isla Dr. Ramsey." "I don't know what's happening," she said, her voice weak and ragged. "The lesions, they were all infected. I have a fever they can to break. They've tried every antibiotic. Nothing is working." She began to cough, a deep, rattling sound. "They did scans. They said my organs are failing. They don't know why. They don't know what it is." Ramsey stared at Sarah's suffering face, then at her own whiteboard, at her notes describing a systemic, aggressive bacterial pathogen. The ticking clock was no longer about her career. It was no longer about proving Thorne wrong or publishing a paper. The human cost of the institutional delay, of the years of dismissal, was right here, playing out in real time on her screen. This was no longer just an investigation. It was a race to save a life. And she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that she was the only person on Earth who knew how. The sight of Sarah Jenkins, pale and struggling for breath in a hospital bed, was the only catalyst Dr. Isla Ramsey needed. The time for secrecy and backdoor channels was over. The next morning, armed with her data and a cold, righteous anger, she bypassed Thorne completely and invoked a little-used CDC charter rule to request an emergency hearing with the Epidemic Intelligence Board. She now stood before them in a sterile, high-level conference room. The board was a panel of 6 senior scientists, men and women with decades of experience, their faces impassive and difficult to read. Ramsey stood at the podium, her voice clear and steady. In a concise, passionate, and impeccably referenced presentation, she laid out the entire investigation. She started with the initial anomaly, the lab note from 2008, about the fiber's heat resistance. She presented the high-resolution electron microscope images and the spectrometry data that proved the fibers were not common contaminants. She revealed the shocking finding from her own off-the-record analysis: the complete absence of DNA. Then, she presented the report from her outside expert, Dr. Meisner, and the stunning link to Agrobacterium tumefaciens. Finally, she presented her own unifying theory. The fibers are not the disease, she concluded, her eyes meeting those of each board member. They are a symptom, a byproduct of a pathogen that appears to have been genetically engineered to hijack human cellular machinery. We are not looking at a delusion. We are looking at the first evidence of a terrifying new class of biological agent. And it is, at this moment, causing systemic organ failure in a patient in a hospital in California. She presented her case not as speculation, but as a direct, evidence-based conclusion, an undeniable chain of scientific discovery. As Ramsey finished, the room was silent. The board members looked at each other, their impassive faces now showing hints of shock and deep concern. Before any of them could speak, the door to the conference room opened and Dr. Marcus Thorne strode in, his face a thundercloud of fury. "This is an outrage," he began, his voice shaking with anger. "This entire presentation is the result of a rogue investigation by a junior researcher who has been emotionally compromised. Dr. Ramsey has been consorting with known conspiracy theorists, sourcing her samples from the internet and violating every conceivable CDC protocol." He turned his attack on Ramsey directly. "Her evidence is meaningless. The samples are obviously contaminated. Her theories are fanciful, the product of an overactive imagination swayed by internet folklore." He addressed the board again. "I ordered her to cease this nonsense weeks ago. Her refusal to do so is an act of gross insubordination. I recommend she be placed on administrative leave pending a full psychiatric evaluation." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Some of the board members began to waver, the weight of institutional procedure and the fear of scandal clouding their judgment. As the momentum seemed to shift in Thorne's favor, the conference room door opened again. It was Ben Carter. He held a thin file in his hands. "Sirs, ma'am," he said calmly, "I was subpoenaed by this board to provide my lab records." The head of the board, a stern-faced woman named Dr. Albright, nodded. "Proceed, Mr. Carter." Ben placed his file on the table. In a quiet, factual voice, he corroborated every detail of Ramsey's lab procedure. He presented the chain of custody documents for the sterile collection kit, the calibration logs for the electron microscope, and the raw data from the spectrometry scans. He proved, with meticulous documentation, that there had been no contamination. The evidence was clean, the data was real. Thorne's entire argument collapsed into a pile of angry, baseless accusations. Dr. Albright looked at Ben's immaculate records. She looked at Thorne's furious red face. And she looked at Isla Ramsey, who had stood silent and resolute through the entire attack. The choice was no longer about institutional risk. It was about scientific integrity. "Dr. Thorne," Albright said, her voice as cold and sharp as a scalpel, "your concern for protocol is noted. You are excused." Thorne stared at her, dumbfounded, as if he couldn't comprehend what was happening. He opened his mouth to protest, but Albright cut him off with a single icy glare. Defeated, Thorne turned and stormed out of the room, his authority shattered. Albright then turned her gaze to Ramsey. "Dr. Ramsey," she said, her tone softening almost imperceptibly, This board is officially launching a Level 4 investigation into this potential pathogen, effective immediately. You will assemble and lead the primary response team. Isla Ramsey felt the tension of the last several weeks drain out of her in a single, silent wave of relief. She nodded, unable to speak. The truth, backed by rigorous, undeniable data, had won. Months later, Ramsey walked into a quiet, sunlit room at a California hospital. Sarah Jenkins was sitting up in a chair by the window, pale and still weak, but alive. The angry lesions on her arms were finally healing, replaced by pale pink scars. The IV drip was gone. "They call it phage therapy," Sarah said, her voice still a little weak but filled with a light Ramsey had never heard in it before. "They use a virus to kill the bacteria. It's working." The CDC had never officially used the word Morgellons. In a quiet internal alert sent to public health agencies worldwide, they had given it a new clinical name, novel dermopathy with filament production. But for Sarah, and for thousands like her, it was something much simpler: validation. "Thank you," Sarah said, her eyes welling with tears of gratitude. "You were the only one who believed." Ramsey gave her a small, sad smile. She looked out the hospital window at the sprawling city below. She had won. The science had won. But as the relief faded, it was replaced by a new, much colder question. This bacterium, this modified agrobacterium that could rewrite human cells, did not evolve in nature. It was designed. It was built. Her investigation was over, but a new one, a far more terrifying one, was just beginning. Who would create such a thing, and why? This story is a fascinating twist on the usual science versus superstition theme. Here, the superstition wasn't a belief in ghosts or ancient curses. It was the simple, unwavering belief in one's own physical suffering, even when the entire medical world insists that you're imagining it. The patients were dismissed as delusional, their experiences relegated to the realm of psychiatric illness rather than legitimate pathology. What's so compelling is how the story flips the script on who represents scientific curiosity. The established medical community, the voice of science, had settled on a dogma. Morgellons is not real. It was the patients themselves, with their online forums, DIY microscopes, and desperate attempts at research, who kept insisting on an unexplained physical phenomenon. They were the ones demanding that science look closer, even as they were ridiculed. This story serves as a powerful reminder that the core of the scientific method is the investigation of anomalies, not the defense of established conclusions. Healthy skepticism is crucial, but when it hardens into a rigid dogma that dismisses first-hand testimony out of hand, it can become a barrier to discovery. So, I'll leave you with this question. In the face of a mystery that defies our current understanding, where is the line between healthy scientific skepticism and a blind dogma that refuses to see new evidence? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.